Hello again, Kathy here, and in this lecture we're going to be looking at value and particularly its use in establishing atmospheric perspective and showing volume. Value means the tone created by mixing black and white into various shades of gray. The image that you see here is a value scale, and every color has a place on the value scale. Every color has a value, whether it's pink or burnt orange or bluish green. We have trouble sometimes seeing what that value is with the naked eye, because the hue or the chroma of the color can often get in the way. But if you photograph a painting in black and white, of course, you see its value structure. And that's what we're looking at in this Baroque project. Achromatic means only black, white, and grays. And of course, everything that you've done in this class so far has been achromatic, since this is a black and white design course. It means without chroma or without hue, without color. In this Shepherd Fairy poster, there's a very, very simple color palette: dark blue, pale blue, this red, bright red color, and white. Very simple, and I think you can imagine how he might have started with a simple shape here, very much like the shape, this dark blue shape, very much like the shapes that you're creating to establish the simple value structure of your image, and then worked over those shapes with perhaps a big red area, then layering on top of that perhaps a big pale blue area, and then layering on top of that these white areas that establish the form by creating different layers of value. So this is exactly what you're going to be doing, except that you won't be working with color. It may seem a big limitation not to be allowed to use color, and of course it is, like being told that you can only write a sonnet rather than a screenplay or a novel, right? It's a very useful limitation, however, and as we learned when we looked at Gestalt a few lectures back, keeping something in black and white, keeping it achromatic, can give it a powerful unity. It can also create a mood, and I think you can imagine that if this photograph were in full color, it would have a very different mood than it has in black and white. Learning to master value, of course, can also help you play with it and use it as an expressive tool in a more full color painting. For example, in this Goya, the painting is almost monochromatic, very, very simple color structure until you get to this bloody red section in the center, which certainly does attract our attention. If the painting had a bright green negative shape, or if the monster Saturn were wearing a blue t-shirt, for example, this bright red wouldn't stand out nearly as much as it does in the almost achromatic setting that it's in. Goya, do you remember the painting that I showed you a couple of lectures back of the beautiful little boy in the red and white silk outfit with the bird cage and so forth? Same painter. He had kind of a double life. Interesting guy. So one of the things that value does is that it gives us the opportunity to use contrast. And even in a completely achromatic work, such as the one you're going to do, contrast is going to be really, really important. Now, obviously, there's value contrast here. In this Ansel Adams photograph, this branch really stands out because it's almost white in a much grayer and darker field. But there are some other factors here that make this branch contrast with its background. For example, its edges are very sharp and much more detailed. The objects around it are either very, very simple or rather soft, right? There aren't a lot of details in the background here. And in fact, those soft edges are another important contrast with the branch. The branch is very crisp. So the detail, the crispness, the value contrast all make this branch really pop forward and seem to come toward us in space and to assert itself as the subject of the photograph. This is a technique that we can use called atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is something that you will have seen if you've ever driven over a mountain pass, for example. The cars in the lane next to you appear in great detail with sharp edges and high contrast, but the hills, as they go back into the mist, get softer and grayer and may even fade into the sky, as in this photograph here where the last hill is barely distinguishable from the value of the background, whereas in front here, of course, you see crisp detail and much greater value contrast. This is used a lot to show depth, and atmospheric perspective is a technique that once you master it is really much less technical, for example, than linear perspective, and can give a very, very convincing feeling of depth. So for example, in this movie still, you see faces here in the front that are much crisper, much darker compared to the lightest part of the image, which is the background. And then as you move into the middle ground, you see the Iron Giant with some contrast with the background still and some detail. And then behind him, dimmest in contrast with the background, you see the very faint images of the buildings. This technique of atmospheric perspective, of course, is used in full-on painting all the time. Seurat, a French painter famous for his pointillist technique, tiny, tiny dots of paint, uses it here in this painting of bathers. You see the figures on the grass up close here, and the clothing lying here are in much higher contrast than anything else in the painting, and their edges are sharper. As you move back into the figures in the middle ground, the contrast is a little bit lower, edges a little bit softer. And as you move into the boats and the bridge and the buildings and trees here, their contrast against the sky is very, very soft, and they're almost melting into the sky. Remember this figure here. You'll see him again in just a minute. And here we see the same thing in a painting by Bruegel, Landscape with the Fall of Icarus. There's Icarus down there. His feet are sticking out of the water. He's just fallen. Beautiful painting which uses atmospheric perspective to get a very, very deep feeling of space. So here in the front, you see crisp edges, high detail, lots of value contrast. As you move back, the value contrast gets a little bit less down here below the cliff where you see the rocks and the boat. Still a lot of detail, but not nearly as crisply presented. Here in the background, you see the cities and the mountains or icebergs or whatever they are, again, almost melting into the sky. When I was in art school, the Mona Lisa was used to illustrate the idea of atmospheric perspective to me. And she's a very good illustration, of course. Leonardo has painted her in great detail, and although she's miraculously soft and her skin is painted with great, great attention to the play of very, very soft ambient light on her volumes, the detail is still a lot crisper and more intensely depicted than in the background behind her. You get the feeling that there's very, very little atmosphere between you and the Mona, whereas in the background, you get the feeling that there might be a mile, there might be lots and lots of space impinging between you and what you're seeing. So even though these are only inches apart in real life, in the illusion that Leonardo creates, there might be a mile of space between this part of the canvas and this part of the canvas. We see a very similar thing going on in wedding photography all the time, where atmospheric perspective is used not only to create space, but also to create focus. So the photographer here, of course, has used a very, very narrow depth of field to get this really, really intense focus on the net here that covers the bride's face. We see her eyes in crisp detail, but even her jawline and her ears are very, very soft. When we get to her hair, it's way out of focus, and when we get to presumably the groom here, we can't even see what's going on at all. In Leonardo's time, it was the norm to focus on the object that was closest and to let objects that were further away go out of focus when using atmospheric perspective. But because we, as artists and designers in the 21st century, are working for viewers who understand the concept of depth of field, at least on a subliminal level, we can take the frontal plane out of focus, say, on the middle ground, and let the rear planes go out of focus. We can choose our focal plane, in other words. Here are a couple of examples of photographs that focus on a middle plane rather than the front or the back. This one is fairly abstract, simply focusing on a barb in a piece of barbed wire. This one, of course, is much more of a storytelling use of focus, so that although we understand that there is a whole line of young men here, it's this particular young man that is singled out for our attention, and we can't help wondering what it is about him that is of interest to us and what his story is. So, a much more narrative way of using atmospheric perspective, not only to give space, but to capture our attention. Now, exactly how are you going to create those soft edges? We're going to skip over to Illustrator here for a minute just to show you how the blur and feather effects can allow you to manipulate the edge so that you can get something that's as soft as a cloud or something that's as crisp, maybe, as the handle of a pot. You start, of course, always by selecting the object that you'd like to blur. Let's grab this piece of the gorilla, and because I'd probably put the same blur on this entire highlight area of the gorilla because they're in the same layer of space, I'm going to shift select the hand over here as well. We're going to zoom in just a little bit, Command plus, so that we can see the edges of this shape a little bit more clearly. They're partly obscured by the selection line, of course. And then we're going to go Effect, Blur. There are 3 blurs here, and the Gaussian blur is the one that I'm going to demonstrate because I think that's the one that will be the most useful for you on this assignment. You're welcome to experiment with the other ones as well. Gaussian blur gives you a window which allows you to select the radius of the blur. If you click the preview button, you will be able to see the blur that is automatically selected, and that's obviously a lot fuzzier than I want. I don't really want to turn my gorilla into a cloud. That's a 10 pixel blur. Let's move this down to about a 1 pixel blur. And we can hardly see that blur in the preview because the red selection lines are in the way, but let's OK it anyway. And now I'm going to select away to get rid of those selection lines, and you will see that there is quite a bit of blur on this edge if you compare it to the edges of the shapes down here, which are not blurred. I'm going to Command Z that, and we're going to look at another effect which you can use to create a blur. The other way that we can blur an edge is with an effect that is a little bit hidden here under Stylize, and this is the feather effect. The feather effect gives us a window that allows us to choose our radius in terms of fractions of an inch rather than pixels. We're going to click Preview so that we can see what 0.07 inch looks like. That's a very, very tiny fraction of an inch, of course. And I'm going to OK it again because it's difficult to really see this with the red selection line in place. So let's click Away. And again, you'll see that the edge is blurred. This time, however, the blur works back from the edge rather than smushing the value out into the surrounding shape as the blur effect itself does. So feather gives you a little bit of a harder edge with a value smear that works back into the shape. Blur smushes the value out into the surrounding shape a little bit more. I find both of them are useful for this assignment, but blur is probably more useful. Let's try blur and feather with some simpler shapes so that you can really get a good idea of the difference between the two effects. We'll open a new Illustrator file here. We'll make a rectangle with a black fill. And put a gray ellipse over it. Very similarly to what you'll be doing in your rendering. I'm gonna move this ellipse down and alt drag a copy of it so that we have two. Let's zoom in just a bit. And now I'm going to select this object and put a blur on it. Blur, Gaussian blur, and we'll ask it for their standard 7-pixel blur. There's a little preview. You can see it blurring. We'll OK it and select away so that you can see it without the selection line. Now we're going to select this one, and we're going to go Effect, Stylize, Feather. And we'll do a little bit, well, let's put the preview on it again so we can see what we're doing. And we'll put a 0.2-inch feather on this. OK it and select away. And here you can see that the edge gets smeared out a little bit into the background with blur, whereas the edge is maintained fairly crisply with feather, and the value is gradated or softened back away from the edge. So you can see that this would be a very good effect if you were trying to give a little bit of a feeling of volume to a shape. This is probably more useful if you're really trying to soften one layer or sublayer into another. So that's blur and feather. Have fun using them to help you soften edges to establish atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective requires us to get rid of the line. We have to be able to treat edges differently, and that means that we can't stroke them in Illustrator. We need to establish where one shape ends and another shape starts by a value change so that we can show crisp edges in some places, soft edges in some places, lost and found contours in some places. Imagine if this shadow were outlined, or even if this pear were outlined, how the feeling of space here would be flattened. So that's going to be one requirement of this assignment. Make sure that you don't put strokes on any of your shapes. And here's that fellow from the Georges Seurat painting that I asked you to remember. This would have been Seurat's studio drawing, his study for that painting. You'll notice that although the young man was facing right in the finished painting, he's facing left in this original drawing. And that's very likely because Seurat transferred the drawing to the canvas by reversing it. In other words, turning it upside down against the canvas and rubbing to get the charcoal to transfer. Seurat loved to work on very, very toothy paper, in other words, paper that had very rough texture, and would grab his charcoal, because this was similar to the effect that he used in paint, where instead of outlining things and filling them in, he built up the colors that he wanted with tiny little dots from his brush. So the effect of the drawing is that you almost have tiny little dots. Almost nothing is outlined. There may be a suggestion of an outline here around the nose area, but pretty much his shapes are revealed to us by value contrast, the passage from light to dark to light. And just as in our Baroque value structure, we see the figure appearing light against dark in some places, dark against light in other places. So the passage of value in the negative shape, the very subtle gradients that are drawn there, are extremely important in showing us the form and the light falling on the form. Let's look at a few more things that light shows us when it falls on forms. Light reveals so much about forms, and the shadows that are cast by light are full of information. So, for example, we see in this Giorgio de Chirico painting that the plane on which this mysterious sculpture seems to stand is quite flat. There's obviously an object here, maybe a building or something, that's casting this triangular shadow, and the shadow cast by the sculpture show that this area is quite flat as a pavement perhaps, whereas the shadow, we call this a modeled shadow, on the volume itself, this tower, reveals the tower to be round. You're going to be drawing shadows. You're going to probably be fudging them at some points because some of the photographs that you're working with won't have shadows that work identically as if they came from the same light source. So think about that as you draw your shadows, how you can convince us that the shadows are authentic and come from, for example, the same light source. Shadows reveal the position and the height of the light source that's casting light on the object, and shadows reveal the shape of the object that's casting the shadow. Cast shadows also, as we saw in the De Chirico, reveal the shape of the object on which they're cast. And this can be a wonderful way of showing the textures of a surface. Light traveling over a surface can show whether it is smooth or whether it has a visual texture. And it can really make a two-dimensional image look as if it contains an actual texture. Any textures that you'd like to describe in the image that you're creating must be drawn with the pen tool. No texture fills or Photoshop textures can be used. Light on a curved surface really helps us to turn a 2D plane into an illusion of 3 dimensions. Light on a curved surface isn't quite as straightforward as you would think. There's always a darkest part of the shadow called the core of the shadow, but that's generally not where the shadow meets the surface. There's almost always some reflected light cast up into that shadow from the surface that an object sits on, unless it's perfectly black or very dark, which actually may be the case in some of your Baroque compositions. The lightest part of a highlight, on the other hand, is generally not the side where the light is coming from, but a little bit past that, because the surface is curving away from the light. So there'll be a little tiny bit of shadow or secondary highlight around the primary highlight, which is set back in a bit. Let's look at that in a beautiful painting instead of a dry diagram. This Pontormo painting, The Visitation, has a lot of secondary highlights in the volumes. And if you look, for example, underneath the chin here, you see a little bit of brightness that helps distinguish the chin not only from the shadow on the rest of the face, but also from the darkness on the neck. That's a secondary highlight being cast by the figure's clothing here up into the shadow. And you'll see that again and again. You'll see it on Mary's hand here, and you'll see it on the nostrils on practically everybody. You'll see it everywhere on the chins. You'll see it up inside the eye sockets, where a little bit of light enters the shadow there in order to show us that volume. Very, very beautiful, so subtle that you might not even notice it if it weren't pointed out, but an important part of the way Pontormo creates these volumes. As you work with light and value, think about contrast, amount of detail, and edge quality to establish atmospheric perspective. Don't forget to use the blur and the feather effects, of course. And as you work with light and shadow, remember that they're one of our most powerful ways of describing volume and showing us information about surfaces and shapes over which light is falling. Have fun, and I can't wait to see what you'll do with value in your rendering.